Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. I'm joined today by my very well-experienced colleague, Michaela Romesser, who has handled a number of TN visas. The TN visa really is a special visa for our firm, not only because our founding partner, Ian Scott, has held a TN visa, but also because for individuals who have a passport from Canada or Mexico and have a job offer in the US, it really is one of the best visa options available. Michaela will be talking today about why that is, why it's such a popular option, as well as what the requirements are for the TN visa. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Our webinars are recorded. We post our webinars to our YouTube channel, which we do hope you'll take some time to check out. Not only do we post longer, full-length webinars to our YouTube channel, we also post shorter videos, and those really do run the full spectrum of US immigration law. Which leads me to my second point, which is that although our firm does focus on business immigration, we do handle the full spectrum of US immigration law, whether that is family-based immigration, temporary immigration, such as student visas, visitor visas, as well as temporary business options and green card options, whether those are family-based or employment-based. So we do hope you'll reach out to us for any questions or assistance you might need. After this presentation, we'll send you a link where you can view our YouTube channel. We'll also send you the presentation that you see on your screen, and we will also be sending you a comprehensive guide on the TN visa, as well as a link where you can sign up for those future webinars. We do try to do at least a couple webinars a week at this point, and again, those do run the full spectrum of US immigration. If you have any questions during the presentation, I will be monitoring those. Please feel free to send them in using either the chat function or the Q&A function on Zoom. I will probably be saving questions for the end of the presentation, but I do expect that we'll get through all of the questions, so don't hesitate to send those in. Without further ado, I will go ahead and pass it off to Michaela to talk about the TN visa requirements.
Thank you so much, Justin, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So let's talk about the TN visa. So the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa that is open to Canadian and Mexican nationals who have a job offer in the US in a profession that appears on the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. So now let's run over these requirements in a little bit more detail. So the first requirement in order to qualify for the TN visa is that you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. One thing to note here is that what matters is the citizenship, and it doesn't matter which country you were born in. So let's say that you were born, in, let's say, India, and later in your life, you acquired a citizenship of either Canada or Mexico. You could still qualify for a TN based on the Canadian or Mexican passport. The next requirement is that your profession must appear on the list of professions provided in the TN regulations. One thing to keep in mind is that not all professions are going to be on this list, but there are many professions included. So I'm just going to list some examples of professions that appear on the TN list. So it's, for example, accountant, architect, computer system analyst, engineer, graphic designer, lawyer, dentist, or hotel manager, and there are many more. The next requirement is that you must have the required qualifications to practice that profession. And again, this is going to be specified in the TN regulations. So you will have the list of the profession, and next to the profession, you will have kind of the specific requirements for that profession under the TN regulations. So for example, it's going to be like the requirement is going to be generally a degree. For some professions, it can be just work experience, but generally it is going to, a degree is going to be required. So for example, for a profession of an accountant, you would have to have either a bachelor's degree or licenciatura degree or a CPA qualifications. For a profession of architect, it would be again either a bachelor's degree, licenciatura degree, or a state kind of license to be able to practice that profession. And again, for the majority of the professions, you would have to have at least a bachelor's degree. There are some professions, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. There are some professions for which you could potentially qualify based only on your work experience, even if you don't have a bachelor's degree. The next requirement is that you must have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. So for the TN, it's not allowed kind of just to come to the US to look for a job. To be able to qualify for a TN, you already have to have a job offer from a US company. And this is generally, going to be evidenced by employment letter from that US employer that kind of, describes the job you'll be performing and the job duties you'll be performing. It will also describe kind of like what the US company does, how many employees it has, where it's based. And it should also specify kind of like for what length of time they are planning to hire you for. And then the last requirement is that in the job you will be coming to perform in the US, you must engage in professional activities that are consistent with that listed profession. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of the degree and if you need to have kind of like a specific degree to qualify for the TN. So when you look at the TN regulation and kind of like the list of the professions, it generally, for example, for an accountant, it only says a bachelor's degree, but it doesn't necessarily kind of like specify, like what the bachelor degree has to be in. Now, it kind of generally kind of like the major has to make sense, like for that particular profession. So like, let's say that you have a bachelor's degree in accounting or, like let's say in finance or kind of like a related field. Then, like you can make an argument that you kind of based on that degree, you qualify for that profession. Now, let's say that you have a bachelor's degree in marketing and you never took any like accounting or finance courses, but like later in your life, like you started doing the work, in that particular case, we wouldn't be able to kind of like make the link that based on the degree you qualify for a profession because the major is kind of like in a completely like unrelated field. And for the profession of accountant, you unfortunately cannot qualify based on work experience only. So just a thing to keep in mind that even though there is kind of like no specific requirement, like what the degree has to be in, the government, like the government official, like they will look at the diploma, the major, and then the transcripts. And it kind of like has to make sense for that particular profession. The examiner will also look at the Department of Labor handbook. It's called occupational handbook when they are kind of, adjudicating the TN petitions. And let's look at the next slide because we have a screenshot of how the occupational outlook handbook looks like. So this is a website, you can go on the website, you just type occupational outlook handbook and then the particular profession like you are looking to qualify under. So here we have economists. So what the examiner, what they usually do at the border or if you're applying at a consulate, what they usually do is if you are applying under the category of economists, they kind of pull up the website and they look at, if they're not kind of that familiar with what that particular profession usually does, they pull up this website and they look at kind of like the usual duties, like that people in these professions do. So in this screenshot, you see the section like what economists do, and that will have kind of like a description of some sample duties. And there is also a section that says how to become an economist, and that will kind of usually explain, like what degree and kind of like what majors are usually kind of acceptable for you to qualify. So it's definitely good, like if like when the employer is drafting the TN letter, to kind of like look at that just job description, pull up this job description from the Occupational Outlook Handbook, just to kind of like make sure that that these two align, because in our experience, the examiners do often look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook website. Perfect. So what is a sponsorship, and do you need a sponsorship for the TN visa? So, the TN doesn't require the employer to file any like forms with the USCIS or with the Department of Labor. There is one exception where forms would have to be filed with the USCIS, and that's a situation where you are already in the US on a non-immigrant status, or you are already on a TN status, and you would like to either extend the TN status in the US without having to leave the US, or like let's say that you are here on a B1 status, or I don't know, like E2 status, and you want to change to TN status. You would be able to do that by just filing forms with USCIS, and you wouldn't have to leave the US. But I would say that in the majority of cases, people usually apply for a TN at the border. Those would be Canadian nationals, or they usually apply for the TN at a consulate in Mexico, just because, like if you apply at a border or at a consulate, like that kind of gives you ability to travel internationally. If you apply with the USCIS, that will kind of allow you to stay in the US. But like if you leave the US, you would have to apply for the visa at the border, or at a consulate, or if you're a Canadian national, you would have to apply for a TN at the border anyway. So in situation where you are applying for a TN at the border, or if you are a Mexican national, if you are applying at a consulate, the employer doesn't have to file any forms with the USCIS or any forms with the Department of Labor. The only thing that the employer has to do is to give you kind of like a signed TN employment letter that will in detail kind of describe what the company does, what will be the job in the US, what will be your job duties in the US, and kind of under what TN category you are qualifying for the TN visa. So that is generally kind of like the only document the TN TN employer will have to sign. Now, TNs are also not location specific. So there are some visas, like for example, the H-1B visa, where every time, like you change location, like you'll be working from a different location, and, a new LCA or like a new amended petition will have to be filed with the government. That's not the case for the TN. You can like move in the US, you can work from a different location, and nothing has to be filed with the government. There is also no required wage that has to be paid to you. Again, for H-1B, the H-1B regulations are very kind of strict, and there is like a specific minimum wage that has to be paid to the H-1B employees. There is no such rule for the TN. I will say that kind of the wage has to like make sense for your profession. So if you are, let's say that you are, like coming to the US to work full time, as an accountant, and your wage is, like kind of like barely meeting the minimum wage in the, in the state, that may raise some questions at the border. But there are kind of like no specific regulations as to, like what the wage has to be, other than it has to, of course, meet like the minimum state and federal wage. So how can you apply for a TN visa? So if you are a Canadian national, you can apply for a TN at the border. This is a great advantage for all Canadian nationals because they don't have to like schedule any appointment. They just come to the border, present the evidence, and they can just apply for a TN visa right there at the border. For Mexican nationals, they do have to schedule an appointment at a consulate. And then they will have an interview at the consulate, and then if the visa is approved, then they will be able to come to the US. As I mentioned, in some cases you could apply for a TN status with the USCIS, and that would be the case if you are already in the US on a non-immigrant status. But that's not that common. Like in the majority of cases, people usually apply at the border or at a consulate. Perfect. So now let's talk a little bit about some differences for Canadian and Mexican nationals. So as we said already, like one huge advantage Canadian nationals have is that they can apply for the TN at a port of entry. There, if the TN is approved, it can be approved for up to 3 years, but this is going to depend on kind of like what's written in the TN employment letter. If the TN employer is asking for 3 years, it can be approved for 3 years. But if they're asking for less, then the TN status will be limited to that period of time. And this is the same for Canadians and Mexican nationals. Your spouses and then your children under the age of 21 and unmarried can qualify for a TD status. Unfortunately, TD spouses cannot work in the US, but they can study, and then your children can study in the US as well. Let's say that you are a Canadian national and your spouse is not Canadian, then your spouse will have to apply for a TD visa at a consulate. But if your spouse is a Canadian national, then your spouse can just apply at the border, like either at the same time with you or after you got the TD visa. Now, Mexican nationals, as we said, unfortunately, they cannot apply for a TN at the border. They have to schedule an interview appointment at a US consulate, and they have to attend the interview. Mexican nationals can get the TN visa either for a period of 1 year or for a period of 3 years. For each of these, like for the visa for 1 year and 3 years, Mexican nationals will have to pay a reciprocity fee. It's a small fee, couple $100 that has to be paid. Generally, we recommend that if you are applying, you apply for the 3-year visa stamp, just because the reciprocity fee for that visa is just a little bit higher than the fee for a 1-year visa, and then it gives you the ability to kind of travel internationally for a period of 3 years instead of a period of 1 year. If you are applying for the TN visa for the first time, you will have to have an interview at the US consulate. Let's say that you are renewing your TN visa. You could potentially qualify for an interview waiver. In that case, you would just mail your passport and certain supporting documents to the consulate, and then they would make a decision whether they are approving without an interview, or they can always schedule the interview. But you would be able, this is only for renewals, and you would be able to find out whether or not you qualify for a waiver after you submit the DS-160 application, pay the visa fee. Then you have to answer certain questions in the US, like the scheduling system. And if you do qualify for an interview waiver, it would kind of show up at the system and give you instructions as to kind of what needs to be done to qualify for it, and where to mail the supporting documents. But if you're applying for the first time, you will have to have an interview at the consulate. Perfect. So what are some difficult TN visa categories? So I would say one of them is definitely management consultant, and the reason like why this category is so scrutinized is that it's one category where you don't have to have a degree to qualify under it. So you can still, if you have a bachelor's degree or a licenciatura degree, you can still qualify like under the management consultant category, but you can also qualify just based on your work experience. So you would have to show that you either have 5 years of work experience working as a management consultant, or that you have 5 years of experience working in some particular area, and then you are coming to the US to work as a management consultant, like in the same area. And again, like the reason like why this category is so scrutinized is that people who don't have degree, like many people just kind of like want to qualify under this category, and so the government scrutinizes the management consultant TN applications a lot. I will say that like if you are applying as a management consultant and you are coming to work in the US, like for like one of the big consulting firms, or you are just coming to work in the US for like any consulting firm, that is going to be kind of like the more straightforward TN application, where it becomes a little bit kind of like complicated is when you are coming like to the US to work for a US company, and the US company, is either like selling goods or provided services. It's not a consulting firm, and then you are coming to work for that company as a management consultant. So the government scrutinizes like those cases a lot. In those cases, you would also have to show that the role you are coming to perform, like the management consulting role, is kind of like supernumerary, like extra role. And generally, they want to see that you are coming to work here for a very kind of like specific period of time. And they also like to see like if you, that you are coming just to kind of like work on a specific project. And then like once that project is completed, like you will leave the US. So for example, like let's say that you are coming to work in the US for a company, the company, like wants to expand like their service offering, and then you are just coming here for a period of 6 months to do like management consulting for that company. And once, the expansion is kind of done, you will leave the US. That would be, like that would be kind of like a more straightforward case. If you are coming to work in the US for like a US company, that it's not a consulting firm, and they are requesting that the TN visa is approved for a period of 3 years, I will say that that kind of case is going to be kind of a little bit more difficult to get approved. Another category that is scrutinized a lot is the TN category of economists. So previously, the TN economist category was used a lot for people who were kind of like coming to the US to work here as financial analysts and also market research analysts. Then in 2017, there was a USCIS policy memo issued that kind of narrowed the scope of the economist category a lot. And now it's kind of, they kind of list the, that only like strictly economists can kind of like qualify under the TN economist category. So if you're, like if you're planning to apply under this category, it would be definitely like good to kind of review the memo. And again, to also look at the occupational outlook handbook and look exactly like at the job duties the economists usually perform, and make sure that the job description of the US company kind of like aligns with the job description of the Department of Labor occupational outlook handbook. So what is the TN visa application process? So let's discuss the application process for Canadian nationals first. So as we said, Canadian nationals can apply at any port of entry. There are some port of entries that are kind of optimized for faster TN processing. And the government does recommend that if you are applying for a TN for the first time, that you apply at one of these designated port of entries. But you can apply at any, especially if you are doing renewal, if you already had TN visa in the past, you can apply at any port of entry. It can be an airport or at the border. You can apply at any port of entry. So what documents you have to bring to your TN visa interview? So you will have to bring, of course, your passport, then the TN employment letter signed by the U.S. employer. So the TN employment letter is going to be, I would say, the most important portion of your application. Because the TN employment letter will kind of describe what the U.S. company does. It will also describe your role you will be performing in the US. So it will have your job title, like very specific job duties you will be performing in the US. And then it should also describe your background. So it should describe your education, you are qualifying under, and also like any previous work experience. And the TN letter is going to be a document the CBP officer is going to review, the first. So it's definitely good to kind of either hire an immigration attorney or to definitely kind of like spend some time when putting together the TN letter to kind of make sure that it explains kind of like all those requirements in detail. The TN employment letter, you should carry the signed original to your interview. So the US employer should sign the letter and then mail you the originally signed letter, and you should bring that letter to the interview. Some ports of entries, like when you call, they may say that they may be fine with the scanned version, but in our experience, it may be just, like some officers may be fine with scanned version, but then you will show up and you will get an officer that wants to have the original. So we always recommend that you carry the signed original to the interview just to kind of, avoid having issues and kind of having to then wait for the original and applying again. And then you should also carry kind of evidence of, your education if you are qualifying, with your bachelor's degree, or if you're applying in like one of those categories where you could qualify with work experience, then you should carry kind of like originally signed employment verification letters from your previous employers, kind of attesting that you worked for them like during these periods of time, you performed these duties. So just kind of like verifying your work experience. If you are qualifying, with your kind of education, then you should carry the original diploma and then the official transcripts from your school to the interview, because the officer will want to see those. So that was the process for Canadian nationals. Now, if you are applying at a consulate, if you're a Mexican national, kind of the documents you will have to bring are the same. And then you will also have to kind of bring some extra documents like so first, in order to be able to schedule your interview appointment at the consulate, you will have to file a DS-160 application. So it's kind of like an online form you have to complete, you have to submit it, and then once it's submitted, you should bring the confirmation pages of the DS-160 form to the interview. After the DS-160 is submitted, you will have to pay a visa fee. So then you will have to also bring evidence that the visa fee was paid to the interview. And then after it's paid, you will be able to schedule your interview appointment. So, once you pay the fee, you will see a calendar of the appointment availability. You will schedule appointment. And then once it's scheduled, you will receive like an email confirmation of the appointment. And then you should also bring that to the interview appointment. And then it would be kind of the same documents as we discussed for Canadian nationals. And as we discussed already, if you are applying for like a TN renewal visa, you may qualify for an interview waiver where, like you would do the same steps, like you would submit the DS-160 form, you would pay the visa fee, and then you would have to like answer certain questions in the system, like, like have you been issued a TN visa in the past, like 12, like 3 years, or like has your TN visa expired in the past 12 months? And like if you answer those questions, you may be eligible for kind of like an interview waiver. And in that case, you would just mail the supporting documents. And then if it's approved, they would just send you the passport back with the visa. But the consulate, even in those cases, like where you qualify for a waiver, the consulate may always decide to schedule an interview. So, and as we discussed already, there is an option to apply for a TN status if you are already in the US. So in this case, the employer would have to file Form I-129 with the USCIS. If they file the I-129 without premium processing, it would take USCIS like several months to make a decision on the TN application. There is an option to pay for premium processing, so that's for an extra fee of $2,805. The government would make a decision on the petition in 15 business days. Just something to keep in mind that, like if the premium processing fee, if it's not filed under the premium processing, the petition would be pending for several months. So in that case, you would either have to file the premium processing request, or it just may be faster to leave and apply either at a consulate or at the border. So what are some tips and common pitfalls for TN visas? So we always recommend that you, if you're a Canadian national and applying at a port of entry, you should always call the port of entry where you are planning to apply and kind of ask them, like what are the hours of operations, like are there, like if you plan to cross, we usually recommend to cross like on weekdays, but if you do want to cross like on weekend, you should definitely call them in advance and ask them, if that's possible. So you should always call and kind of ask about the hours of operations, if it's possible to cross over weekends, and just kind of ask, like if there are any kind of specific documents they want to see, but generally it would just be the documents we discussed. Then, as we said, like you should always carry the originally signed employment letter from the US employer. And another important thing is to kind of make the employer aware that the person that signed the TN employment letter should be available in case the CBP officer calls to kind of verify certain information in the letter. In our experience, it's not that common that they call, but like sometimes they may call to just kind of verify that, the job offer is bona fide, or to call to kind of like verify the job duties you will be performing. So definitely kind of, like keep in touch and kind of like inform the employer of the day and time you are planning to cross, and let them know that they should be available on call, like just in case either the CBP officer or a consular officer calls to verify certain information. As we said, you should bring the original diploma, official transcripts, and then the original signed version of the employment letter to the interview. As we said, like some ports of entry like may tell you that they are fine with the scanned version, and it may be fine, but our recommendation is to always bring the original, just in case that you get an officer that just wants to see the original. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So it's not a green card. It doesn't kind of allow you to, like live in the US permanently. It is a non-immigrant visa, and you do have to show that you have a non-immigrant intent. So this usually doesn't become an issue like the first time you apply, so like let's say that you have lived in Canada or Mexico like the majority of your life, and you are applying for a TN visa for like the first time or second time. In our experience, like if you're applying first time, second time, like they don't usually like question the non-immigrant intent. It's always good to like bring some supporting documents with you and just kind of have the documents ready if they start asking questions. But it generally becomes an issue like if you are renewing the TN visa for like the third time, fourth time. So like let's say that you have been living in the US and like on the TN status for like the past 15 or 20 years, then definitely the officer could at some point kind of like start asking you like more and more questions about the non-immigrant intent. So some documents, you could bring to show that, like you do have intent to return to your home country, or for example, like if you own a property in your home country, you can bring evidence of that. If your family lives in your home country, evidence of that. If you have kind of bank accounts in your home country, you can bring like the 2 or 3 most recent statements, and just kind of things like that that show that you still have ties to the home country, and you are planning to come to the US on the TN status like temporarily, but like at the end, like you plan to return to your home country. And again, like in our experience, like this doesn't really become an issue, like if you are applying first time, second time. But at some point, like if you have been like living here and like renewing the TN for, like multiple times, then at some point, like they can just kind of start asking like more and more questions about your intent.
Great. Thank you, Michaela. So we had a number of good questions come in during your presentation. We'll just go ahead and go down the list. You touched on this, but do you actually need an appointment to go to a border crossing to get a TN? And if so, how do you get an appointment?
Yeah, so you should like call to the port of entry like where you'll be applying, and they may tell you, but in our experience, like you don't need an appointment, like you can just show up and then they will process the TN visa application.
Perfect. Can an H-2B worker, so someone who's in the US on an H-2B, apply for a TN visa, or I think what they're asking is TN status, while they're under their H-2B contract?
Yeah, so you can change status in the US, like as long as you are in a valid status. So if you're here under the H-2B, it could be possible to apply for a TN change of status. You could do it like while the contract is valid, or if there is a grace period for H-2B workers, like it may be filed after, but generally, yes, like if you are in the US on kind of like any non-immigrant status, it may be possible to change status to TN.
Perfect. And this next question is a somewhat common one that comes up. What if the TN job opportunity is for a remote opportunity where you're not actually required to go into the office? Do you need a US address for the employer, and how do you structure the application if it's remote work?
Yeah, so we usually mention like in the TN employment letter, we mention like this is the US, and like remote work nowadays is so common. I would say like before 2020, like they could like in our experience they were asking like more and more questions. Like nowadays, we kind of disclose in the TN employment letter like this is the US company headquarters, and then the employee will be working remotely from, like if you already have like a location where you'll be working from, like we could input like exact address, or if you know the city, like you want to kind of work from, then we would just kind of describe it. And in our experience, like it's not generally an issue.
Perfect. This next question is one I've had to look into. I'm happy to answer it, Michaela. Can a Mexican national change the employer at a port of entry? So this question comes up a lot because the government has actually issued conflicting guidance on this. Sometimes they say you can, sometimes they say you can't. But what happens in practice usually is if a national of Mexico tries to change the employer at a port of entry, Oftentimes, Customs and Border Protection will say that they don't have authority to do that, and they will not grant the change of employer. Um, if you want to try, I do recommend calling the port of entry beforehand and seeing if they're familiar with the process, because arguably they can change the employer if you already do have a valid TN visa and you're just looking to change employer. But just be aware that there is a good chance that you will be denied. And if that happens, you would need to apply for the visa at a consulate. Or if your TN visa is still valid and you're going to re-enter on the existing employer, you should be able to continue using the old TN visa, but just be aware it could have some complications. Um, Michaela, can I obtain a 3-year TN visa initially? And what are the possibilities for further extensions?
Yeah, so both Canadian nationals, can get the TN for up to 3 years. Again, it's going to kind of depend on what's like what's written in the TN employment letter. But if the job offer is for 3 years, like then you would get the TN status for 3 years. For Mexican nationals, it's they can get the visa either for 1 year or for 4 years. But again, it would kind of depend on like what's the period of time specified in the TN employment letter. So that's going to be important. What are possibilities for further extensions? So as long, like if it's for the same employer, like as long as they want to keep you, the job, will still fall under kind of like like one of the professions that's specified in the TN regulations. It's the renewals are usually like pretty straightforward. Like if you originally got TN and the renewal is for the same job, same job duties, then the renewals are kind of generally straightforward. And just one thing to keep in mind is the non-immigrant intent. Like if you keep extending, then at some point like that may be an issue.
Great. Michaela, we had a question about the dependent TD visa that you mentioned before. If a spouse gets a TD visa, are they eligible to work? And
Yeah.
if not, what options are available to them?
Yeah, so unfortunately not. So TD spouses cannot work in the US. Like there is no kind of exception to that. So if they do want to work, like then the spouse would kind of like need to qualify under, like some other like non-immigrant visa category that would allow her or him to work in the US. But on the TD status, it's unfortunately like not possible to work in the US.
So this next question goes to the title of this presentation, which is, does the TN require sponsorship? So Rita asks, when you're applying for jobs, sometimes they ask a yes, no question. Do you require sponsorship? Now, the question says for H-1B or TN, the answer is different for the two because, as Michaela explained, the requirements for a TN are far lower than an H-1B. And our answer, our recommended answer would be, the answer is no. Do you require sponsorship? If you're applying for a TN, you do not require sponsorship, as sponsorship is defined in US immigration law. Um, it hopefully the employer would be open to a discussion, and oftentimes our firm will speak with employers to explain what the differences are. All an employer needs to do in the context of a TN is sign a letter saying, we intend to employ this person. They don't need to pay a prevailing wage. They don't need to test the labor market. They don't need to pay for the person to return home if they lose their job. None of the requirements for an H-1B or an employment-based green card apply to the TN. So in our professional opinion, the answer to that question, if forced to answer yes or no, is no, a TN does not require sponsorship. If the employer wants to have a further discussion, we're happy to help with that through a consultation. Um, so, Michaela, I think this is a follow-up on a previous question, and I think we're kind of gradually working toward a line here. But what if the U.S. employer wants to employ the TN worker remotely from their home country on a TN? I'm not exactly sure why the TN would be needed, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in that, like, let's say that you are a Canadian national, and then you find a job in the US. In that case, you don't, because like if you'll be working from your home country, then you don't need any kind of, a US visa because you'll be working from your home country. So, like, let's say that you just got a job offer from a US company and you want to work from either Canada or Mexico. Then, from like a US immigration law perspective, you don't need any visa. In that case, you just wouldn't need the TN visa.
Great. This next question it comes up often. What is the time frame? Once you get a TN visa, how soon do you need to enter? And I'll add the question, how long before your job starts can you enter on a TN?
Yeah, so we generally recommend like to enter like 10 days, like no longer than 10 days before the start date in your TN employment letter. And then what was the first question? So once you receive the TN visa, is there a deadline? Yes, I would say like, like let's say that you receive the TN and then, like then you don't enter for like another like 5 months. Like I would just say like that may, like at some later point, like raise questions, like why you didn't enter when you had a job. So I would say like it should be like a reasonable time after, like the TN was approved. Because like let's say that you got the TN visa at a consulate, then there are several months you didn't enter, and then you enter, then I think like either like the border agent or like later, like when you apply for a US visa at some later point, they may just kind of question, like why did you enter such a long time after the TN visa was issued? But like if it's like 1 to 2 months, like that may still be a reasonable period of time.
Perfect. So this next question is a few parts. You answered the first part. Can I come with a TN letter from the employer, though I don't have a job offer? The answer is no. A TN requires that you have a job offer and you're coming to the US to fill that job. The TN is not a visa intended to allow you to search for a job. The next part of the question, DevOps engineer, what category should I apply under? That's a great question that we can discuss during a consultation. We can get into the specifics of your job duties, look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So reach out and schedule a consultation if that would be helpful. On a TN, am I allowed to work as a W-2 employee or independent contractor? There's actually not a requirement that you work as a W-2 or an independent contractor. Um, Usually the border official is going to want to see that it's typical for the profession. So it may look strange if you are saying I'm being hired as a full-time accountant, but as an independent contractor. That might look strange. Conversely, if you're applying as a management consultant, you will likely have a more difficult application if you're a W-2 employee. So it really is application and circumstance specific. Um, excuse me. This next question also has multiple parts. If I need to resign from my job in Canada, how can I do that if I can only get the visa 10 days before starting my US job? I think you're going to have to think about the logistics of it. All we really can speak to is from the perspective of US immigration law, which is that CBP does not typically allow you to enter more than 10 days before your US job starts. Um, for the jobs that have financial analyst as a title, which category should I use? Again, great question to discuss during a consultation, and we'd be happy to do that. How do I explain to US employers that I can work in the US in TN status? HR reps confuse TN with H-1B. Um, we unfortunately can't speak on behalf of HR reps who do confuse this a lot. We have created videos on our YouTube channel to talk about how sponsorship is not required for a TN. We have webinars on that topic. You should feel free to send the employer to our YouTube channel, our YouTube videos, our webinars, which are recorded. If they still don't understand, we're happy to speak with them during a consultation. So I would say those really are the pathways to help explain this to a confused employer. Um, Michaela, can a couple both apply for a TN visa? Would that give a higher chance of the officers rejecting the TN visa?
Yeah, so absolutely, and I think it's quite common. I don't think there is kind of like a higher chance of rejection, like as long as like each of you qualify for a TN. Like you can either apply together, like like you'll go to the port of entry together or separately. So that's completely fine, and it's quite common.
Perfect. Let's see. If I am looking for a job in finance and want to enter the US with a finance degree, would an H-1B be more reasonable than a TN? That's that's a difficult question to answer during a webinar. There are some reasons why an H-1B would be preferable to a TN, and why a TN would be preferable to an H-1B. It's a great question for a consultation, though, because we would need to get into your background, your qualifications, what your goals are, and your time frame, since the H-1B really is rooted in the fiscal calendar as well. So do schedule a consultation. Michaela, great question about the USCIS Form I-129. If a Canadian citizen is in Canada, does the employer need to file a Form I-129, or is the Form I-129 only needed if the applicant is in the US?
Yeah, so the I-129 is only needed if the applicant is in the US and the applicant wants to apply for a change of status or extension of status. So that's the only situation. If you are in Canada or Mexico and you are applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, the I-129 is not necessary.
Perfect. And then the final question, how about for nurses? Can I bring my family?
Yeah, so for any TN visa holder can bring spouses. The spouse would get a TD status. Again, it's not allowed for a spouse to work in the US, but the spouse could study. And then children under the age of 21 and unmarried can come on the TD status as well.
Perfect. Excellent questions, everyone. Michaela, thank you for sharing your expertise. We do hope you'll keep an eye out for our follow-up email. Sign up for future webinars. Please visit our YouTube channel, visit our blog, and if it is helpful to talk through the details over a consultation, we'd be very happy to do so. So everyone stay well. We hope to see you again soon. And Michaela, thank you again.
Thank you.